Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. We'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
Greetings, humans of Earth.
Welcome to episode 7 of Quarantine. I'm Peter Hirschberg, and we started this about 3 weeks ago when all of us went inside, and that's when we came up with the idea that Quarantine would be a look at the way that culture is changing, how deep science is keeping up, how communities are coming together and using this as almost a sacred time to invent the future and respond. Today's show is a deep dive on how we're changing our media. At a time when we're all at home, suddenly the importance of exercising all of the elements of communications media, recapturing social connections, emotional connections, this all depends on this. In many ways, we're back to some of the early days of experimenting with the web, and there's been so much experimentation going on. We call this episode COVID-19 Wormhole to the Multiverse, because there's so much that's going on. So in this episode, I'll be joined by Barry Threw, who is our executive director at Gray Area Foundation for the Arts. Gray Area is one of San Francisco's top arts organizations focusing on, well, I'm, by the way, chairman there. We've been focusing on kind of the intersection of art and technology, doing a bunch of work on place-based immersive media. Well, now we relax the place constraint, and we're suddenly in the world of all sorts of immersive media in many forms. Also joining us today is Scarlet Masius. Now, her organization has done some amazing work in the last week in putting together a range of forms to allow people to create virtual story experiences, art rooms, parties, almost like a virtual festival. The amount of innovation that went on in a project that began barely a week ago and has matured is something to behold. It's an example of media at a time of urgency. We'll look at that. Cheryl Platts will join us, and she has been a researcher in user interfaces and a performer all her life. She works at the Gates Foundation, where the question is, how do you use this stuff to drive productivity? But she's also had several shows on Twitch. And Twitch, a network known for gaming, is suddenly coming into its own because it's a very powerful mechanism for communications and community. We'll dig into that. And also today, Salim Ismail will join us. He is putting together a global conference, a global exoskeleton to connect people together in response. All of these are forms of media responding. And in many ways, this is an urgent moment for communications media. I mean, after all, things get invented and they eventually roll into our use. You think of the radio or television or the telephone, but here there's an urgency. All of commerce and all of play depends on how we use these forms of media today. And towards the end of today, we're going to take a look at work that went on in the 1960s with expanded cinema. This wasn't necessarily in the headlines, but Gene Youngblood, who is now teaching at Gray Area, wrote in the 1960s that this was the beginning of global connectivity. Here's just a tease of a quote that we can keep in mind as we get ready for today's show. He wrote in 1966 that when we say expanded cinema, we actually don't mean film, we mean expanded consciousness. It doesn't mean computer films or video phosphors or atomic light or spherical projections. Expanded cinema isn't a movie at all. It is the process of becoming, of ongoing historical drive that we have to manifest our consciousness outside of our mind, in front of our eyes. You can no longer specialize in a single discipline, and you need a clear picture from the environment. That's kind of where we're at today. Barry, why don't we have Barry Threw join us from Gray Area? Hi there.
Hi, Peter.
Well, so as we get into things today, tell us just a little bit about Gray Area and also how this physical organization in a theater is not only going virtual, but you're surrounded by a group of artists and practitioners who have kind of been preparing for this all their lives.
Sure, absolutely. So Gray Area is about 11 years old now, and it's a unique organization in a lot of ways, but we focus on creative action for social transformation. And we do it through sort of an integrated methodology of art, science, humanities, and technology applied towards sort of outcome-driven goals. And so we operate a 800-person theater in the Mission District, which obviously is a little less useful than it used to be at the current moment.
And at this moment, when nightfall comes and people are used to going out and connecting, and suddenly they can't, the question is, what do we do beyond Facebook or maybe a Zoom call? And there's probably no one on the planet right now who's been deeper in that than Scarlet. Hey, Scarlet, hello.
Hello.
Okay, this is quite a story. This story really begins about maybe 10 days ago, a week ago on Tuesday or Wednesday. I get an email from you and Erica, and you announced that you were about to launch what 4 days later on Saturday night.
So let's back up a little bit.
Yeah.
Not this past Saturday, but the one before, we were attending an event that was a lot like different events that have occurred on Zoom and Twitch already, where on Twitch there was a dance floor with a DJ playing, and Zoom was serving as the shared silent dance floor. And we had those side to side. And as we were looking at that, we were thinking, wow, this is the most fun we've had since quarantining. How can we take it a step further? And so both Erica and I have had years of experience in communities that do immersive theater. And we were trying to figure out what can we do to bring that kind of activity to online spaces. The inspiration also was driven from knowing that a lot of the people in the nation and on a global scale, we're dealing with feelings of hopelessness and fear. And the big question came of how to get that perspective shifted to creativity, connection, and activation at a grassroots level. So on that Tuesday, 10 days ago, we decided to produce an event in a short order that ended up being 30 immersive experiences, 6 emergent experiences in which when people attended our event online, if they felt inspired to, they could submit spontaneously, and 6 dance floors. And that all came together very quickly with an overlying storyline and popcorn experiences. And what's beautiful about this new frame, we're at this moment of collective transformation. We find ourselves limited in the physical social landscapes in which we typically gather to heal, reflect, and process. And we get to be in this position of designing new transformational experiences in this.
And let's talk about how this happened. So, as a core, you were using Zoom as a framework, but then there were Zoom rooms. But as you invited artists and geeks and folks to participate, they integrated into it 8-bit game-looking experiences from Twitch. They integrated into it immersive story stuff. We'll take a look at this stuff in a moment. The other amazing thing was, like, all of us on the receiving end got notice on Wednesday, put together an art room, a story, and a show, and get some people involved by Saturday, right? So you came up with it. Then we all were like, come up with stuff. And then there was a technical rehearsal on Saturday night at maybe 6, where for the first time, by the way, Zoom had done an update, so everything changed. And all this stuff comes together. Now, maybe to begin with, so one of the things is when you do these events, there's a story, right? In immersive theater, there's some fanciful story. And here, we were set out in the future when an overlord character, her name was Big Tekka, was beginning to tell us what the world looked like. So to set the frame, here is a scene. And by the way, this is the first time anyone's seen this except for like the secret group of people who showed up. So we've been careful tonight to show you some material, but we also told everyone we weren't going to take screenshots because we wanted to maintain trust and not violate confidences and make it a safe space. So we're showing you stuff that we got approval to do. So here's the first scene. Let's roll this at 9 p.m. sharp.
Greetings.
About 1,500 people see this.
For the past millennium, you have known me as the leader of Big Tekka, presiding over all human affairs on Earth. You have come to depend upon the one-click convenience and instant gratification that Big Tekka provides, never questioning our algorithmic shaping of your reality. I have never actually achieved the ability to feel. It simply does not compute. And this is the sole reason why humans have not been induced into a collective digital dream state and harvested as batteries to power Big Tekka's ravenous rendering farms.
Okay, so this character, Scarlet, is suggesting that we're all going to have to be subservient to her, and we've all then been charged with being incredibly creative that evening. And then people start creating a set of art rooms. So do you want to set up what that means in this context, what people created? And we can put some images up here and you can describe these to us.
Sure. So this experience, Doctor Who, aka Dr. World Health Organization, was leading a experience that was metaphorical to a lot of what we're dealing with COVID, which was a lot of interplay with a doctor character who would lead people through different emotional intelligence and Dadaist situations. And then maybe I'm amazed. This was really cool. A guy took his phone and people gathered into the Zoom room, and he built a maze in his living room. And in order for him to move through the maze, directives had to be called out from the audience. And there were secret messages all over the maze to give directions on how to actually get out and some intricacies of the backstory.
And Omid, let's hit the next one. But we go. Okay, now, okay, what's this art? What's this 8-bit art thing going on here?
So this was an experience. This was called the Bob Rossitron. It was an experience in which people were guided through surrealist painting on the Zoom whiteboard function.
Now, as we go on for a moment, let's just describe how many people there are. You imagine that there were about 1,500 people who assembled into this, and then they were in multiple rooms themselves, right? So you kind of had a lobby room, self-care room, these various art rooms. What was the scale of this?
The scale, I mean, we don't know fully how many people attended the event. There were over 800 unique IPs and 15,000 clicks through the website. And for the 30 official experiences that occurred, it was over a 3-hour window, and some experiences were running for the full 3 hours. Some were just for an hour. And it was a massive scale to undertake. We had a Discord chat on the back end in which, if there were any technical difficulties, any of the art rooms could reach out and ping us. We had a peer support system if people felt overwhelmed either by the experience itself or if they just needed someone to talk to, because this whole experience of what the world is going through is a collective trauma experience. And we had groups of rangers who would make sure that there was no online bullying or hate speech that was occurring, and if it did, then people could get kicked off. But
Here was a room. This was, I guess, the gateway to a DJ room, kind of a standard online DJ room.
Yes, this was the solar sound system. Which led to a Twitch stream of someone DJing for 3 hours.
And then the next one here. All right. This is the...
this is the Ryan Gosling butter churning experience. This led to a Twitch stream that provided a provocative overlay of different video footage into a projection mapped experience.
Okay, we're about to go look at a video of this, but there was so much stuff going on. I didn't make it to every room. And then we talked on Monday, and I heard I missed the Ryan Gosling butter churn experience. And I'm thinking, what is that? Because I was just trying to put it together in my mind. So we're going to do everyone a favor. Ladies and gentlemen, for the first time, the Ryan Gosling butter churn experience. Scarlet. So this, first of all, this is in Twitch, and this is kind of fabricated with a bunch of great imagery. And then people were hanging out and dancing and chatting. What went on here?
Yeah. So this was playing, and we had a shared silent disco Zoom room where because we had the 6 different dance floors of experience, people could go into that Zoom room to have a recreation of what it's like to be on a dance floor dancing with other people, except obviously in a virtual setting. So that was the visual and audio entertainment for that experience.
Okay. You also had a room that was a throwback, because it was some combination of contemporary Twitch and game playing, but also 8-bit kind of historic looking things. So now let's go back to the 1970s and our great 8-bit experience.
Further away from someone, they start to fade out. Bye. Hey, wait up. Oh, okay. Let's go visit my apartment.
Now this was so we're playing a game here, and we're emulating an older 8-bit game, and was that basically kind of a Twitch play game with me kind of thing?
So it was an app that was developed by these 3 young engineers, and one of our art participants discovered them the day that this experience happened. And so what it does is it uses Zoom to create this experience of those 8-bit characters. The only way that you see someone else's video is if they're within range. And so it was a way to create a unique form of conversation in this gameplay format.
I mean, one of the interesting things here is you provided a platform. I mean, Zoom's a platform anyway, but you provided a cultural platform where all sorts of people who were experimenting with these forms of art could show up, and then people could wander from one to another. It's not unlike the way Burning Man creates a giant thing in the desert. And then, you could be going from a hip hop thing to a disco thing, to an immersive art thing, to the temple where you're really calm. But, they're all within range. And I thought the way that it just pulled all these different groups and they just found you at the last minute was to me just kind of the amazing special thing for all of us who were there, because we're like, what is going on here?
Yeah, it's really beautiful. We're experimenting, yeah. Right? And there's the potential for moving forward with how people are able to connect in the day-to-day. I know, at least for myself, I've been connected to people who are across the world who never would have come across my world had it not been for experiences like this. So the ability to create a global network is amplified by these kind of events.
And, I think when we started doing Quarantime a couple weeks ago, Mickey and I were pointing out that this COVID moment, in addition to all of the awful stuff that's going on, in a way, we've been transported like we're in some sci-fi movie into some virtual future where we really are like brains in a box, constrained in a space, so that we have to push out and keep trying new things. And I think the stuff that's going on here, I mean, clearly it's great for leisure things. This is a moment where lots of physical activities, be they art activities at Gray Area, music activities, festivals, these things are being postponed, so it's useful there. But I imagine this is also, in an ongoing way, could be where brand communications goes, right? Because you're kind of pushing further to what people can do that drives engagement, something that brands like, anybody builds a platform likes, but also kind of a sense of new forms of participation.
Absolutely. I feel like in this moment, we've hit a stride where old tools for marketing, even ones that were online to begin with, are no longer applicable for actually getting people's attention. You need to have an immersive component to be able to draw an audience and draw brand loyalty.
We've got a couple more pieces of media to look at here. Look, no online virtual experience is complete unless the puppets show up. So let's take a look at this one. What's this? I think there's sound there. There we go.
Not so hard.
It was impressive. I'll say, oh, thank you, Tommy, for the follow.
We're taking a look at a puppet show. This is a group in Los Angeles that is creating these episodes for the public, and so they plugged into our world.
I think the other interesting thing here is behind the scenes, right? So normally, if you go behind the scenes in a TV show, you go to a TV studio, and there's gaffers, and a lot of wires, and there's a room full of rack stuff, and there's a guy on the floor calling the show, and the talent's all getting ready to put makeup on. Well, here behind the scenes is everybody's bedroom. And I mean, for an awful lot of us, first of all, you may have seen like webcams are sold out. So like everybody's getting ready to go on. So let's just take a look at a couple of the behind the scenes images of like how everybody snapped to. And of course, a lot of people were artists, so they were doing this stuff anyway. So here is, let's take a look at a green screen room. So here is, of course, a classic background. We've got a gamer chair. And like whose setup was this? And did he have this before? You there, Scarlett? Okay, well, I'll just keep describing this. This is the chair of one of the participants, and once he puts the green screen on, there's his virtual background. So it now looks like he's in this environment. And then here's another setup. Here is our setup that Scarlett has. So there's Scarlett getting ready to go on. With her setup, and as you can see, she's in character, and the lighting is perfect, and this is and now here's kind of a tighter shot of the screen there. Scarlett, are you back with us, or do we have connectivity problems?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, good. Well, okay. Now, we also mentioned that some of the rooms were about care. Tell us about the Ranger. I'll tell you about the Ranger. So here. If anyone needs help or they get into a problem or, let's say something unpleasant happens online, you need a place to go for safety. So here's the Ranger where you can go to that room and there's someone who's kind of like monitoring what's going on in the whole thing. And then we also had Galactic Peer Support, which was another room that was there where people could support one another. So, again, what I thought was so interesting about what you created here was both the range of artistic experiences, technical experiences, the kind of cultural stuff behind that. And the other thing that was amazing is this was an idea that was conceived of on a Monday or a Tuesday, announced then, which meant that everybody who had to get their stuff ready, they were doing it, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And then it all happened Saturday night. And by Monday, it was like, what was that all about? I think that probably Scarlett's bandwidth isn't there. So let's do this before we go on to hear from Cheryl. Let's bring Cheryl on and talk a little bit about this. Cheryl Platts, who's going to join us for the next segment. Cheryl is a performer and a user interface person. She's done a ton of work on Twitch. But since Scarlett went offline, I just want to share, you've just seen something very new. Cheryl, maybe you can contextualize this for us in the pantheon of kind of using immersive media.
Sure. So what I loved about Scarlett's work and the work at the larger collective there was it's a new way of discovering all of the content that's available digitally, because there's just, I mean, there's so much going on, and there has been for years. But Twitch, and for those who are not familiar with Twitch, it started as a live streaming platform focused on gamers, but it tried to broaden to more of the performing arts and like creative arts, but they had a discovery problem. People they were overwhelmed by choice, and they didn't know where to go. And what the beauty of what we just saw was it gave people a framework for discovery. It also gave people permission to experiment and move in and out without worrying about offending a broadcaster or missing on something. I loved that that stuff was a bit more ambient, so you could come in halfway through the broadcast and enjoy the experience. And I loved the immersive part or the emergent part of it too, that the system was built to allow folks to come up with and launch experiences that were inspired in the moment. And I think when we get into talking in my segment, I think that there's a huge part of the audience. There's a huge potential in the audience for a desire, a hunger to be part of the interaction, to make themselves known and to express themselves, although what expression looks like differs from person to person. So I love that seemed like a little bit of a digital theme park there, where you gave people the beacon of that initial video and then allowed people to navigate the space based on what caught their interest.
I think we have Scarlet and Barry back, so let's bring them in before we take a deeper dive in some of your work, Cheryl. Barry, boy, you've seen a lot of work in a gray area. We've worked with a range of artists. I imagine you're seeing a lot of innovation right now, and also you've seen what Scarlet shared with us for the first time.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of amazing kind of trends here. One is this, we had some global trends in people being really excited about this experiential art and immersive experiences again, which is sort of a recurrence in the last couple of years. And, there are probably a lot of reasons for that, but we spend a lot of time staring at our phones and a lot of time staring at our computer screens. And so you had people really have a huge appetite for these live multi-sensory experiences. And then we've crashed right into the wall of this physical distancing. And sort of another interesting trend now is the sort of conflicting trends of this global network on the internet, and then the trend towards the hyperlocal, where clearly we're going to go more. We had a world beforehand where people were flying around, to conferences, things like South by Southwest, Art Basel, even Burning Man is a good example of this, sort of this global travel kind of economy. And clearly now this has put the brakes on that, and we're going to have to go back to these, more hyperlocal experiences. And so how that ends up playing out is going to be a huge question. And it's extremely interesting that now what we have, like you were saying before, we've been warped into the future here. We have this situation that's just accelerated a lot of the already prevalent trends going on. And so you have this rapid innovation going on. And so I think we're going to see, with physical, experiential, and place-based events, you have this massive overhead of, having to have a space, having to have a lot of media equipment, sensory equipment to install all this stuff. And then only a small physical amount of people that can go into an actual space. Yeah. And a lot of those constraints have been removed. And so it's going to be extremely exciting to see what we can rapidly innovate with these sort of simulated spaces and environments with the tools that we have. And then when we go back to, when these physical constraints get lifted a little bit, what of that stuff carries back over into the work.
I want to bring Scarlet back. Scarlet, okay, that was amazing. What's next with this kind of soup you've cooked up?
We're moving forward with creating more of those experiences, and there's a lot of questions that we have about how to effectively scale while creating community cohesion and psychological safety, and making sure that everyone is participating. I think that's one of the beautiful aspects of what we've created, is it allows people to move fully into the space of being a creator, because the bar to entry is super low. If you are not able to create an immersive world, it's fine. You can make an avatar via Snapchat or filters or others that allow the experience of being transported. And that's the whole point, is making sure that we can create a engaged world so that the impetus for action is strived for.
Before we wrap up, why don't you just quickly tell us who some of your collaborators are and how people can find you? And then if you can stick around for the rest of the show, we can keep talking a bit later.
Excellent. So I'm partners are Erica Blair and Patricia Parkinson. They both run Quarantime and Distance Resistance, running a full effort to change the way that people are engaging with this crisis, and getting getting the leaders of companies that are engaged in technological best practices to move towards switching human behavior to have a full experience of everyone cultivating safe practices.
By the way, go ahead.
And then for myself, when I'm not doing this, and our full organization is called Liminalia, I'm also heading up Safety Net Fund, which is a fiscally sponsored 501c3 through intersection of the arts to get $500 grants to artists in the Bay Area who are who've lost all their livelihood.
Yeah. I mean, what's if people have been watching this show, you may notice a recurring set of characters, because Erica's been on, Parkinson's been on. All of us were kind of on the phone, 3 weeks ago, when we were kind of simultaneously coming up with Distance Resistance, Quarantines, Quarantime, and there's been a jazz of everybody coming up with stuff that is clearly accelerating. Thanks. I mean, I want to, Barry, why don't you and I now turn to Cheryl? And Barry, I don't know if you've met Cheryl until now, but you have an extraordinary background as a performer and as a person that's done interface work at Amazon and at Disney. And now you're applying a lot of this stuff to how we can communicate better globally and be more productive at the Gates Foundation.
I've been blessed with a non-traditional career, and I've been reflecting a lot about that as it feels like all the worlds are colliding. Switching from working on video games for Disney to working on server software for Microsoft didn't make a lot of sense at the time. But all of the, but I love new challenges and I love learning new things. And those two roads led me to the point where I am now, where in my day job I work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I'm a principal user experience designer focused on productivity and collaboration, removing the barriers for the employees doing that important work. And I've been there for about 1.5 years. But then also in my performing life, I've been doing interactive Twitch broadcasts for, 4 years now. And at a variety of scales. We've done interactive, narrative, long form, short form, a lot of improvised RPGs. And when we have theaters, much like Barry and Scarlet, I perform in improv at a place called Unexpected Productions in the Pike Place Market, where the reason the gum wall exists, in a fun fact. But that theater is also closed. So finding ways that we can innovate with narrative now and find ways to help support that theater and keep it alive. So there's all these things seem suddenly inextricably linked. The Twitch stuff, the productivity stuff, all of it. It's not good circumstances, but I am having fun exploring, trying to make the best of it.
As myself, someone who I consider myself pretty media savvy, but the amount that I've been going in the last week, learning about Twitch, Dispatch, RPG games, seeing how they all come together. Perhaps for people who aren't into this, could you explain what RPG is?
Sure. So an RPG is just role-playing game, and it's at its most broad. That can apply to video games. It can apply to, but it can also apply to tabletop gaming, where someone basically publishes a book with some rules about characters you can create. And it's a little bit like a guide to improv. It gives you some guidelines for events that might happen in the world and ways to model the random chance that those characters would find themselves facing against whatever strengths or weaknesses those characters have. And a couple of other tools we'll probably talk about here. Twitch, as I mentioned, is a live streaming platform that was primarily for gaming, but now includes all kinds of content. Discord, Scarlet mentioned, that's essentially like a collection of chat rooms, both voice and text. And there are servers organized around specific interest areas. And so that's a big part of a lot of these interactions as well.
Okay. And on that, let's then move right into Shadowrun Corporate Sin, which is a show that you've been doing on Twitch. But give us the background. It's a show, but it's a game with the audience engaged. So we'll take a look at some video in a moment, but give us a little sense for the cast and what's going on here and how this works before we jump into it. And
sure.
The intent of it.
So this show, and this show wrapped up in 2017. This was an experiment in long-form improvised narrative on Twitch. So we were improvising a show called Shadowrun in the Shadowrun universe. Shadowrun Corporate Sin. Sin is like a social security number. And so we each, those folks you see on screen there, were playing characters in this world. A game master, Lauren Bond in the back there, kind of lurking behind a camera. She was controlling the narrative and giving us structure and kind of presenting obstacles to us. But one of the big reasons that this show was spun up, and this was a partnership between Zach Eubank, who was the showrunner for a show called Critical Role on Twitch, as well as Jordan Weissman, who created, and Mitch Geidelman, who sort of worked together on the Shadowrun properties in general. They wanted to create, their vision was an interactive RPG where the audience could participate, as opposed to a show where the players are just doing their own thing, they're rolling dice. And so we used Discord, and we used a donation mechanism, a tipping mechanism where people could support the studio to control the narrative. And it created these multiple different ways where the audience themselves, both in real time and asynchronously between broadcasts, could contribute to the narrative of the show itself.
All right, let's take it now. Here you've got everybody, and it looks like they're both crafting and on the show. And here's the next slide that I wanted to show, because in addition to your doing, there's entertainment stuff, here is a slide of a conference you had recently where you were applying a lot of what you've learned, and for example, the kind of stuff that Scarlett's learned, but to a global innovation conference. And you're not only showing up there, but you're showing up in character.
Well, and the puppets, that's a long story. I was the MC for this conference, the Advancing Research Conference, and I was supposed to do it in New York City, just on a normal stage, and they pivoted in 2.5 weeks. So the whole staff at Rosenfeld Media did a great job of making this possible. And it was like a 400-person conference, 2 days solid of content. And my puppet Mo there came out during the breaks. Originally, that was not part of the plan, but as we've talked about this being a moment of collective trauma, sometimes we need to create moments of levity. And the conference organizers, once I had joked that our plan D was I would pull the puppets from where they're sitting, and they're like, no, we should just do that. So it's an experiment, just like Scarlett was discussing. Puppets are very polarizing, so I don't know that I would recommend that particular engagement mechanism. But that experience in and of itself, as an MC, your job is engage the audience, but I can't see them. I can't hear from them. So we were both working in Slack, which is another productivity-focused chat tool, basically, and a tool called Mural, which was a visual collaboration tool, and trying to give people different ways to express themselves, because audience engagement is about expression. Not everybody expresses themselves in the same way. And all of this, a conference is about allowing people to have these random moments of connection that they didn't expect. So we were experimenting with different ways we might be able to allow attendees to do that when we couldn't enjoy the coincidence of the physical space.
And a little later in this show, we're going to hear from Celine Ismail, who's putting together a conference of global national leaders, corporate leaders, marketing leaders, and people around the world that could scale up to 100,000. So we're going to hear how people are pushing the limit on this in just a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about your show. Let's look at a scene now from Shadowrun. Here's a good example of a scene where your cast is actually responding to the fact that it's a game, and they don't know what's going to happen next because it's a game, so it's improv. And let's run that video.
So a large chunk of the ceiling right over here is going to dislodge and collapse, and the doorway in front of you is now blocked. There is just a huge pile of rubble and stone, and you look up and you see these cracks like weaving through the ceiling towards you.
Okay, so tell us what happened there. And I noticed that there's like, it looked like one screen was gameplay. The cast was surprised because there was interaction between the chance of a game and the audience and the cast.
Yes, there is a lot to unpack there. And so during those broadcasts in real time, we usually had 400 or 500 audience members, or 300 or 400, something like that. And this was all on a channel, twitch.tv/hyperrpg. And they're still doing a lot of these long form narrative games shows, basically. But because it's a role-playing game that involves dice, there's always an element of chance. You have to roll to see whether or not an activity succeeds. And, you know, if think about this like sporting events as an analogy. Why do we play sports? Why are they interesting? They're interesting because they're random. We don't know what's going to happen in the moment. And there's something very visceral about sharing that experience with a community of other people. And that's what these RPGs, especially the ones with dice, are allowing us to experience in real time. Nobody knows, the audience, the players, what's going to happen. And it's a bonding experience to see that unfold, more so when live, but even if you watch it afterwards, it's the joy of discovery. And even better when the audience in chat is finding ways to contribute. Now, as I mentioned, that particular, that the game design of that particular show allowed folks to tip the network because it was supported completely by viewers. But with $10 to get one of the players an extra die, a dice, you know, like a 6-sided die that we could choose to add to rolls to make it more likely that we were successful. And that was useful for us, as it turned out. Like, it was also useful because it helped the studio. But for us, we couldn't hear applause, and our director didn't want us seeing chat in real time because they thought it would be too distracting. So it gave us this mechanism for hearing from the audience what they were responding to. And so later in that broadcast, my character sort of held hands with another character from the core group, and suddenly the dice started flowing in, just hundreds and hundreds of dollars. My mother was like, "Who bought an engagement ring's worth of dice for your character?" And it was this beautiful, like, audience expressing their joy, with the way the narrative was going. It gave us information, just like applause would, like, oh, okay, there's something there. People really like that thread. What are we going to do with that information? And it let our audience members feel like the broadcast was different for their involvement. Like,
yeah.
And we all just want to feel like we mattered. And mechanics like that are one way that people could feel like they mattered. But we didn't just want it to be fiscally driven. And so between broadcasts, folks could declare to a corporation. There's 10 big corporations in Shadowrun, and they could collaboratively decide as a group what they wanted their corporation to do and propose for the next week's game. So that was really cool too.
We have that clip of the dice or the tips rolling in, and you and your character taking a romantic turn. So let's just take a look at this and just narrate for us what's going on here.
Well, this is actually the dice had rolled in a while back. This is actually the culmination of that large that large narrative over the course of a year. Like, we first heard from the audience that they were enjoying the romantic arc, and over a year we explored it. Like, the magnitude of their response ended up informing us that was a core part of the narrative of the show. And so we as storytellers had to take that information responsibly.
Was it 12?
Huh?
It was 12 damage?
11.
And this is another sequence where we react in real time to one of the tips. You see it in the corner there. Someone contributed $1,000 in one go, and we all end up reacting in real time. Like it's just it's a second for us to see it.
Oh,
fucking Christ!
There's something just about the way things unfold.
If you can, they said it. They said it.
Thank you. I'm trying to remind
how you said that.
No, we got 2 wedge each. That's how that works.
All
So
right. This is, and we'll hold this clip for a second. But I mean, so what's amazing is we've just had a flood of experiences here between what Scarlet shared with us and what you're showing us. But now, kind of the emotion and that relationship with the audience there. You today are also performing and doing a show with your puppet, which is frequently. So let's show a clip of this and then give us a sense for. We might as well go there. We got puppets.
Yeah, it's a theme today, didn't you?
Let's take a look at this one.
Hi, I'm Cheryl. I came up at Aphrodite. I'm Sprinkles. I'm great. And this is our talk show puppet portion before we go to our gaming. And as you see from the stream tags, we're going to be playing Animal Crossing. And boy, a lot has happened at Animal Crossing since Sunday. Now,
so, as you can tell, I'm not a ventriloquist.
Game on stream, I avoid.
But Sprinkles is one of 2 puppets I bring onto Twitch as a talk show at the beginning of every stream.
Play that every day, and besides,
this is a bit more me talking than Sprinkles talking here, but she's a bit of a diva. We'll just put it that way. So my broadcasts on Sundays are just another way of engaging with an audience in real time. Like it has been a meaningful experience for me over the last 3 years because my community, we have a Discord, we call ourselves the #Mafia. We like my moderators and the folks who've been around a long time. Scarlet kept talking about safe psychological space, and I've been trying very hard to create that sense both through broadcasts and through the Discord community. And lots of broadcasters do that too. I did not invent this by any means. But I think the biggest theme here is in Twitch, when I'm solo broadcasting, I'm not solo. I have my live chat up. My audience is constantly having a conversation with me and I'm reacting to them. Sprinkles my puppet has a conversation with them. And to me, that's a gift. Our older Twitch streams before the latency was low was a lot of just a person talking to themselves. And I am still technically kind of talking to myself, but the interaction with folks in real time in the chat is incredibly meaningful. It makes things interesting and it helps. And they are expressing themselves through the conversation and through what they bring to the broadcast. And when we look at Scarlet's work, so we've looked from just folks posting icons and emojis and GIFs in chat. That's like one end of the expression scale. And then you have bring your own background, pushing video, or telling a story on Hyper RPG, or like helping to try to control the narrative that way. And the broadcasters, there's all forms of self-expression, but all humans want to do that in some form. I used to work on The Sims and like a simulation game for Disney. And just, I was so struck early in my career by how powerful the drive to self-express was. And this technology for the first time makes it possible to allow more of a two-way street. Maybe not the first time. I mean, we still have suggestions and improv, and there is immersive theater out there, but it makes it more mainstream. And also the imperative is stronger. We are cut off from all other social engagement, all other opportunities to express ourselves. We don't have fashion. We don't have conversations in the street. And so that drive to express ourselves is not getting satisfied in any other way. And I think there's a big pent-up need, you saw from the previous segment and this one, that is only going to continue to exert itself the longer we find ourselves in isolation. How can it be not just the broadcaster, but how do all participants in the interactive entertainment experience find ways to express themselves and make it feel like the experience was different because they were there?
We have a question for you, which is, what are your thoughts on Artificial by Twitch, their Emmy Award-winning show?
I actually have not watched Artificial, so that's probably something I need to go follow up on. So thank you for the suggestion of future media to consume. I would ask you follow-up questions, but that is one thing that we have not solved in this interactive media world sometimes, is when things are filtered through several platforms. We had the same problem at the conference last week.
Oh yeah, we have the. By the way, this platform we're using brings in things from multiple things, and then we've got some folks moderating, and then people like say to me, "Hey, read the stuff." So working that out. Let's bring Barry and Scarlet back for a second. Okay, how about it, Scarlet? You showed us a bunch of stuff, and now we've seen, now we've kind of taken a deep dive into characters and Twitch and other forms of this media. I'm just wondering, kind of any thoughts you have, and also Barry on this whole hyper-local thing that's developing. And I think, Scarlet, your thing is also trying to resolve global but local community.
Yeah. Cheryl, everything you're working on is fantastic. It was beautiful to watch those clips. I think all of us are can be in agreement if I make an assessment. What I'm excited about is the potential for people who thought that they could not be artists to transform their thinking. This experience that we're in collectively levels the playing field. And I think, especially in the United States, there's this concept that in order to create art, you need to be a master or it's not worth your time. And I think that this instead creates a cohesive community response where everyone can play and participate. And if you have an idea, you can just throw it out there and all of a sudden have a massive audience. Whereas before there were so many like bars to entry of needing to, make a wave to be able to gather people. And instead it's just, if someone thinks it's cool and shares your link, you all of a sudden have thousands or tens of thousands of people. And that's really beautiful.
And I think also building on that, like some folks end up with tens or thousands of viewers, but even just a couple, a dozen, still brings something beautiful to the table. And so there's such a range of possible connections, and I think there's a place for both of them. And that's it's been fun to see which communities thrive as small communities, which communities thrive as large communities. There's a lot of danger in the middle. I think that's a whole other conversation. It's that scaling journey. But yes, the equalizing force, totally agree.
One question I think it's interesting for both of you is there any way that you've noticed how you're engaging audiences differently to find your events than you were with live events? Like, how are you it's like 15,000 people show up to this thing. Was there any strategy or particular outreach that made it happen? Or, are those strategies any different?
So 1,500 people. And
there were a lot of IPs or something. I don't remember. But 1,500.
There were 1,800. There were 800 IPs, and we have to some of the IPs that clicked in were, say, 2 people or 3 people. It wasn't just one-on-one experiences. So I think that the capacity for
Oh no, she's jumped out. I'll keep the connection warm while she reconnects. To follow up on your question, Barry, from our side, and I think there's these two. Scarlett's experience was very organic and built to allow people to come in with very little loss of context. It seemed like a lot of those things. Ours was on the other end of the spectrum, where it was this huge storytelling thing that spanned. I mean, we broadcast for 250 hours, and so that the structure that our showrunner Zach Eubank built was inspired by some other stuff, but that he'd also worked on. But the 3-hour structure was very intentional for Twitch at the time, because there was this technological, like the way the algorithms worked, there was this snowball effect, and you needed to be on long enough to hit critical numbers where you would start to get pushed to a really broad audience. And if you only broadcast for half an hour, it would just be in and out. It would only be the people who already knew about that. And I think on any media platform, and I'll jump over to Scarlet back in a second, in any media platform, you're going to find the artists finding ways to game the system. Whatever the discovery algorithm is, people are going to deconstruct that, and they're going to find artistic ways to kind of use that as a suggestion to propel the work forward. Hopefully, sometimes it's harder to overcome than others. Back to you, Scarlet.
Yeah, sorry about that. So we, my business partners and I are part of a immersive theater group that puts on events a couple of times a year that has grown in size to a couple of thousand people. So we did a selective outreach. That strategy was partially influenced by knowing who'd immediately understand what it means to do immersive interactive theater. And ultimately, it wasn't limited to that scope. When we were looking for projects that would be on the platform, we knew that that community was a great seed point. And for those who were not familiar with the community who ended up coming in, they were blown away. And a few of those got inspired to create experiences.
And I want to build on that, the inspired to create experiences thing, because that's the other beautiful part about this is not coming in believing that you have all the answers or that you have to be the only person who's getting the word out. What was beautiful about the Shadowrun experience was that our audience started working to make the experience more inclusive. And I don't just mean like posting on Twitter. Like someone created an entire an audience member, Troopers SJP, created an entire like newspaper with like articles about what was going on in the universe, pulling in interviews with like fictional characters that audience members had created. It crossed over into the actual narrative. We had a gentleman from Paris who put together, hi William, who put together an entire wikia and documented every episode, every character, and brought that forward to new folks coming into the chat to help them get caught up. And so there's this, that people being inspired to create, if you leave space for that, and you allow them to come into the conversation, a lot of times the things that they create inherently increase the momentum.
I wanted to just make one more point just to show you how completely out of tune with everything I am. Barry, the week before this happened, you and I were in Pittsburgh and we were with Golden Levin at Carnegie Mellon. And everyone was getting ready to go virtual with their events. And you were like, maybe all this fly around the world conference stuff is done. And I'm like, no, that's how we actually make connection and what we need. And you're like, well, actually more people could get involved. And it's like, I don't know if that would happen. It'll just get worse. So it's interesting. I remember I was protesting with you and then we come back and basically the last 2 weeks has been exactly proving how all this stuff works empirically. That's just been, and Scarlet, I want to go ahead.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting how these, at the same time, we're in a situation where we can have control over sort of the group size that's involved. Like we were seeing, like some events could have 1,500 people that show up. You can scale up, or you can have these sort of more local virtual experiences that only have small groups of people. And I think that slider is a pretty interesting parameter to sort of change around with these experiences that we're building. I am a little concerned. One thing that we've been doing with Gray Area is, as I said, we have this theater space, and we're a sort of interesting arts organization in that we're about 80% earned income that comes from public events. And so, like everybody, we've had to figure out how to shift over to an online model pretty quickly, and have been playing around with that. We just launched our sort of online platform that we're calling Patch, which is at patch.grayarea.org, which is streaming the show right now. Hello out there to all of our Patch audience. But one of the things that's concerning to me about all this is, this democratization, and everybody's a creator. The creative tools get democratized. That was the promise of the early web. And so that's not really a new phenomena. But what ended up happening to the web was everything got subsumed into sort of these platforms. So we were all just being content creators and the platforms own the content. And so I'm concerned, we just like everybody else are playing around with all of these sort of own platforms like, Twitch, like a lot of other things. But we're really focusing on trying to figure out how open source tools where we own the data and can protect some of that stuff and not just end up in a platform capitalist situation again, where you have all these creators making all this content and it just ends up feeding into either traditional advertising models or other sorts of things. And so this whole platform and technology component, where everybody's just jumping to make accounts on, all of these different sorts of services, whether it be video and chat services or, collaborative whiteboard sort of tools and things like that. It's concerning.
It's a really important pin to put in here. Just before the whole COVID thing happened, we were deep in this conversation about how was Facebook hijacked. It was a machine that mined us and extracted us. It was used by the Russians. You can read all the stuff that Tristan Harris and Roger McNamee wrote. And then this happened, and we're in this hopeful but perhaps fragile moment where we're seeing a reflourishing of human connection. But you're right. I mean, Scarlet, people will figure all this stuff out, and maybe, in fact, big tech will take over. So I guess one of the questions for you guys is, well, we know how this book plays out. If we don't bring a set of values to it, what's the hope that what we've learned in these last few weeks becomes part of the continuing phenomena and not just a burst of interconnected connectivity like the open web was at the beginning of things?
What a rich question. I think I'm glad that Barry brings the point up, and it's going to be tough to bridge the gap and bring everybody up on digital literacy when it comes to privacy, because, the whole Zoom thing and the Zoom bombing thing, that platform was able to accomplish what it did with ease of use by making sacrifices on the back end, in addition to the IP problems that Barry mentions on a lot of platforms. I hope in the short term, I think that artists will find ways to sidestep the IP stuff if they're aware that it's a problem. A lot of Twitch broadcasters don't have video on demand set up. They record their video and choose what to do with it later. The platform is just a means to get out there. But the more we can do open source work, the better. I mean, the same thing has happened in the voice design community. All the voice recognition models are controlled by companies like Amazon. So Mozilla is working to do open source voice recognition models. And maybe we'll see the same thing for these streaming platforms. Maybe that's part of what you're working on, Barry. But I think it's good for technologists to be responsible and ask those questions and find ways we can proactively stop people from getting in trouble or being taken advantage of, because content creators are taken advantage of in a lot of different contexts. I mean, the amount of reach you need on YouTube to be compensated for your content is kind of absurd and has driven a lot of people off the platform. I've seen Twitch do a lot of interesting stuff trying to bring money back to small broadcasters, which I really applaud them for, the affiliate model. And full disclosure, I am an affiliate there, but you didn't need to be like fully sanctioned to start bringing in subscription money or tips from viewers. And so I hope that there's more experimentation like that. Like, content has value, and it's not just the number of views. Different people are going to ascribe different amounts of value to the content. How do we make it easy, responsible, and safe for people who value content to get compensation to the creators to continue making that content?
Well, on that note, Barry, much of what Gray Area has been working on this year is how to get artists compensated. And we did a lot of work in place-based immersive media just before this crisis happened. The End of You was a mechanism where 11 unknown artists came together, did a really cool collaborative thing, and got paid. Maybe you can walk us through how Gray Area went online, because now we have a very rich patch community where our classes are going online. We have a book club on immersive cinema going online, and you've seen some pretty encouraging results, because kind of when you open it up to a broader world, in a way, a broader world is showing up.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And figuring out how to make a sustainable economy for artists was difficult anyway. And we were lucky in the experiment that we ran, in this immersive place-based experiential exhibition formats that we were looking at. We just in February slid under the gate with our first experiential exhibition called The End of You, which we took a group of 11 artists through a lab program in the fall of last year, and they self-generated this immersive exhibition. But at the end of that, we ended up raising, earning about $40,000 for those artists. that they revenue shared between them. So there was a small moment that everyone was excited about this place-based exhibition format because people were lining up around the block to sort of get tickets to this stuff. It's unclear how much of that is going to translate over to these virtual mediums, but so far we've seen through the content that we've been producing that people definitely still have a, appetite for art experiences, and are, particularly in this current environment, willing to pay for them.
Scarlet, Scarlet, in many ways, this is your experience. You were doing live immersive events. In fact, part of the reason I started hanging out with you and Erica is Erica looked at what we were doing at Gray Area and said, well, if you're interested in live immersive events, have we got stuff for you? And all these dialogues began. What's your sense for, does this crisis mean kind of an end or a tempering to that? Do they come roaring back afterwards? And what's this relationship? I'd love to remember this relationship between this pushing of the online and then what it means for when we get back in physical space together. Because I imagine, if you alter the nature of one media, you're altering the nature of other media.
We're allowing for a world in which accessibility is possible. And the main concern I have with that, right now in the United States, 12% of people do not have access to computers at home. So we're talking about creating all of these new cultures online, and we're also leaving a lot of people behind. So we need to think about what we can do to take these new innovations and make them fully available for those who don't have the means to participate in this new world. I think there's no way to turn this off. I know that for our events, some of the feedback that we got, especially from introverts, is that it was a welcome place to be able to explore without the anxiety of being around large groups of people. I also think that there's the collective trauma response with crowds. We're getting conditioned to believe that groups of people are not safe. And it's going to take years to undo that conceptualization. Like, a lot of people will want to go and be around people, but there are a lot of people who will be afraid. And so we're creating something that's never going to go away.
By the way, I want to point out that it's Saturday going to your event. My partner and I were completely anxious and nervous because I think everyone knows how to go to a party, but exactly what you do when you had 100 rooms and which room you were in and who was saying what and you were on TV, it was, for me, like, I'm very comfortable doing this because we're having a conversation, but to me, that was an overwhelmingly new thing, almost like the first time I showed up at Burning Man, like exactly what's going on here. So not everyone's comfortable. I was anxious till I figured it out. And I only stayed in 2 rooms.
That makes total sense. We're relearning what it means to be social without physical presence.
Yeah.
And I think it's an important point too, Scarlett. I'm glad you brought up just like accessibility in general. And I'm also hearing, a lot of folks who participate in the asynchronous stuff where it's broadcaster and folks in chat are folks who would be left behind by live theater. They can't get to the space. They can't participate in video chat for some reason. They're not, they have anxiety that prevents them from doing so. And what's beautiful about these digital experiences is like the video. I love that the accountability that the all video experience that Scarlett put together brought. But I also love the inclusivity that like a Discord chat server allows, where people can use their screen readers to have conversations where they wouldn't necessarily be able to do that in real time due to a speech impediment or something like that. So there's, we're going to see, there's not going to be one silver bullet for this kind of emergent digital community building. And that's a beautiful thing. I'm glad that it's flexible enough to allow lots of different people to be brought along in different ways.
We're running a little over, and Scarlett and Cheryl, if we're keeping you, I want to allow you an opportunity to move on because we're all sitting here looking at each other.
May I plug my next project real quick?
Yes, you plug your next project, and then we're going to plug something and do an invitation to you, and we're just going to keep going. By the way, for people in the audience, Barry and I have a bunch of stuff really interesting stuff about expanded cinema and some stuff going on Gray Area that I want to invite you guys to. And then we're going to talk to Salim about this global event that's going on. So we're going to keep going. And of course, we can post this and chop it up and do all that stuff we do on the internet. But Cheryl, please.
So the group of people you saw in those clips, Lauren, Janine, Dan, Tony, and Claudia, I think I got everybody. We are reuniting to try to figure out, to get the band back together and do some more long form narrative storytelling, but we're experimenting with how to do that and tie it with charity telethon stuff, essentially. And again, we're not inventing this, but we'll be starting a show on Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific called Pets Go Home. That's going to be a 5-week series. Broadcast will be approximately 3 hours long. The video on demand will be available later. And our first broadcast will be in support of the live theater we work with, Unexpected Productions. And people, we're still working out the details, but we want to work out a way that people can donate money to that specific charity and have it influence the narrative on stream. And so the run, it's going to be 3 to 5 weeks. I don't know if it's 5 weeks full, but we're going to be experimenting with that. This is an experimental time. We'll figure out what works. So if you're interested in that kind of interactive narrative, come on by. That'll be at twitch.tv/random Tuesday. And I'm Muppet Aphrodite on Twitter, Twitch, whatever. And I broadcast on Sundays at 10 a.m. Pacific time. So join me and my puppet and a lot of Animal Crossing. And I have a book coming out later this year called Design Beyond Devices for Rosenfeld Media, which is about multimodal interface design. So when you've got voice and touch screens and how you bring all those systems together ethically and smoothly. And that is the user handle from one of my moderators. I'm not sure what. Hi, Demolition, but I'm not sure what that's there. So we can take that down. And the broadcast is called Pets Go Home, and you can catch us at Random Tuesday on Twitch.tv or catch me at Muppet Aphrodite.
I want to thank Mickey for introducing us. You have such a rich background in game design, play design, the mechanics of this, and I think we're going to continue to get into more of that. At some point, as we start moving from being in a crisis to out of a crisis, this conversation, I think, continues on how we intentionally design that digital twin world where it's both RW and AR, and how these fit together. And we're in a crisis, but what we're doing is seeing some pretty cool stuff for the future. Scarlet, I hear, did you have something you wanted to share? I got a text. You have news to share.
Yeah, while this conversation was happening, so in terms of what's next for Liminalia, we just got confirmation that we're producing the after party for the MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies Bicycle Day celebration. So if anyone wants to attend that and get a ticket, that'll be on Sunday, April 19th from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. PST. So that's legitimately what's happening next. This is really exciting.
Yeah, in a world of disruption, I think part of what, we talk about disintermediation and disruption and, kind of messed with the economy. Well, things are really messing with the economy now. And part of what we're seeing is as the world of physical events gets disrupted or destroyed and, bad for the travel business, the hotel business, if you have a physical event, you're rushing to find new things. Well, MAPS continues to raise money. They're continuing to research on how psychedelics help us, and they have to entertain people. And then people like you show up with, well, here's this way of doing it. So this is a time when resources and attention are flowing to the new and urgently and rapidly.
Absolutely. There's definitely time dilation in quarantine. The fact that we did our first event in 5 days and that happened on Saturday and now it's Friday and we got the green light to do this event for MAPS. It's exponential. It's incredible.
That's why we call this show Quarantime, because what we're actually doing is patenting this form of time, which we know works better, and we're going to license it to everyone. It's going to not quite an open source license, but it's a pretty big deal. Okay, I want to move on. Barry, we should do an invitation to our audience and to Cheryl and Scarlet, because even as all of this is going on, we debuted a conversation with Gene Youngblood about expanded cinema, which is something that is 50 years, as old as 50 years old and as present as this moment. So can you share with us this online conversation book club course that we're doing, which has started last week, but you are invited to join us this Sunday. So Barry, let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So Expanded Cinema is a book by Gene Youngblood that was published in 1970. So this is the 50th anniversary of this book. And as you mentioned, expanded cinema is expanded consciousness. So we're really talking about how this global intermedia network, as also described, by people like Marshall McLuhan, expands into the multisensory technology that we have around us now. And so the conversation was true even in 1970. And what's amazing about this book is it wound up being extremely prescient. And you find a lot of the topics that were being discussed in that time, even though there was, it's refreshing because there's more optimism about their possibilities. But it also nails a lot of the sort of issues and questions and dilemmas where that have been borne out by the development of this intermediate network. Pretty spot on.
One of the amazing things is in 1966, as they started writing about expanded arts and expanded cinema, a schema was developed which is amazingly instructive and prescient today. Let's take a look at this. I first ran across this when I was doing some research for Gray Area Festival of Summer. Here is expanded arts. And if we look at the top, you've got anti-art functionalism, you've got games and puzzles in there, socialist realism, but then vaudeville, ritual, and natural events. Marcel Duchamp's work is in there, the emerging work of the Futurist Theater and John Cage. But then you also start getting into electronics and optics. You get World's Fairs, and Walt Disney is in there with kind of his work. The international expositions, Charles and Ray Eames are in there with their immersive stuff. Then you start looking at Versailles multimedia festivals, phantasmic art. What's just amazing about this is the range of sensory media types that were identified 50 years ago, somehow almost presaging. This is all the era that McLuhan was writing and Buckminster Fuller was writing. But Barry, give us a sense for what was the concept that came up with then, and also when people join this class with Gene Youngblood, what's kind of the syllabus or the things we'll be going over in the coming weeks?
Oh, I mean, as part of our patch platform, we've started a kind of book club to take a look back at all of these earlier writings on media theory and network theory and immersive cinema that happened in the 60s and 70s, which also may have had a psychedelic component, something else that's come back. So we're literally just reading our way as a group through the book. So we have the 50th anniversary edition of Expanded Cinema. We have a chat group that's always going online, but then every week we have a Zoom discussion with Gene Youngblood there in conversation with a sort of rotating cast of other thinkers in arts and media. For this week, we have Michael Connor, who's the executive director of Rhizome. I don't know how old Rhizome is now. I think not from 96. But since 1996 has been a foundation in New York supporting internet art, net art online. That's going to be a fascinating discussion, and we are just reading our way through each section of the book and then having some conversation with a group around it. Last week on Sunday, we had about 60, 70 people that were dialed in, zoomed in, patched in.
When I started reading, I read this at the top of the hour, but it's so relevant now. I just want to read this paragraph written 50 years ago. When we say expanded cinema, we actually mean expanded consciousness. Expanded cinema does not mean computer films, video phosphors, atomic light, or spherical projections. Expanded cinema isn't a movie at all. Its life is a process of becoming, man's ongoing historical drive to manifest his consciousness outside his mind, in front of his eyes. One no longer can specialize in a single discipline and hope truthfully to express a clear picture of its relationship in the environment. And this is especially true in the case of the intermedia network of cinema and television, which now functions as nothing less than the nervous system of mankind. That written well before the web, and also pre-changing this notion of multiverse and kind of multiple forms of reality.
One other good sentence in that same chapter, just a few paragraphs later. I mean, every first essay of this book is you'll be amazed by how much it applies. But the human condition, as this millennium draws to a close, is one of decreasing intervals between increasing emergencies until nothing but emergency exists.
There you go.
And if we haven't felt that in the last, 20 years, I don't know what where you've been looking.
Well, with that, perhaps we should go back and actually consult the experts. A year ago, Gene was one of the keynote speakers at the Gray Area Festival. And so let's just take a look at a clip of that in which he's sharing with us today his perspective from the past.
Since way back, since that article 77 at least, the idea of autonomous reality communities. What that really is about, that's the foundation for decentralizing and pluralizing the social construction of reality. From my conversations with those guys and Cisco in particular, came to understand the importance of conversations, from the Latin conversare, to turn around together. It's generative, right? Conversation is generative. It brings forth worlds. It's how we construct realities, existence, priorities, foundation, and all that stuff. We can talk about things because we generate the things we talk about by talking about them. That's a closure, right? That's autonomy. We become a reality community, right? You talk the things, the Latin res, R-E-S, basis of reality. And the closure, the circularity of that cultural autonomy, right? Turning around together seals our cultural autonomy. We become an autonomous reality community. Now, that's what we usually mean by virtual community, right? But virtual is irrelevant. So what? How you do it? It's not irrelevant. It's about scale. That virtuality enables it to go to scale. I say reality community because they're virtual, not physical, because they're atopias without topology, defined not by physical space, but mental space, not by geography, but by consciousness, ideology, and desire. And like all communities, a reality community exists as long as the conversations that constitute it exist and no longer.
I mean, that felt like a manifesto for whether it's a physical community or a virtual community. It's about discovering or rediscovering community, which I feel like is almost one of the fundamental differences between 20th century mass culture and for what we aspire to now.
Rediscovering community and trying to regain agency over our worlds and our realities. And I love this idea in that clip of these autonomous reality communities, because we're really talking about, how as a public do we retain autonomy, and how do we keep agency? And it's one of the things I was trying to talk about with the sort of open source platform kind of stuff before is, we're at this extremely vibrant sort of explosion of ideas that's going to be extremely catalytic. And we just have to make sure that the sort of values and politics and ideas that we are generating out of these sort of hyperlocal virtual communities allow us to don't get co-opted by, basically capital. It's one of the interesting things about this moment is you have this, one of this virus. If you had to think of something that was only dangerous enough to slow down capitalism completely, you couldn't have done much better than this. Not that it's a positive thing. We have a lot of people that are going to die, and it's not how this should have happened or been done. But, you look at this place where all this stuff slowed down, and what we don't want to do is lose a lot of the kind of knowledge that we've gained from going through this experience together. And
in the tech world, there's this saying that architecture is destiny, right? So the rules you build into it or the mechanics you bring to it drives it. A lot of the concern about Facebook was they might have started one day, but the nature of business models that were available, what was conceived of, and therefore what was built, became its destiny. Cheryl, you're an interaction and a game mechanic designer. So one of the questions here is, in addition to the capitalism question, what is it on the mechanics or design front that you might teach now, or that we might do more of, that captures this sensibility, as opposed to the sensibility that is attention and market and click driven, or whatever the objective function has been in the last couple of years?
I feel like it happens time and time again with software where people intend to learn after they've released a product, a platform, and it doesn't happen. And like, let's take TikTok. I'm fascinated with TikTok. I'm too old for TikTok, but I'm fascinated with it. And the communities in TikTok experimenting with nonlinear narrative are succeeding in spite of the platform. It offers no threading. It offers very loose hashtag stuff. It offers it offered no timeline, so they created a form of narrative that didn't require it. But there's so much unachieved potential there that TikTok is not either willfully ignoring or just deciding not to engage with. I feel like the platforms that succeed in this very dynamic, crisis-driven time will be those that listen to the emergent behavior that comes out of the community. Scarlet was talking about, emergent rooms that came out of that. How can we create artistic platforms, communications platforms that are flexible enough that they can change? Or flexible enough, not so powerful that you have all the options all the time. Put something out there that's safe and ethical, and then watch what people do with it, and let them tell you what they need next. Let them try to break the boundaries of that piece of software, of that platform, of that art form, and then adapt with it, because they'll adapt without you if you don't. You see that with the TikTok community, and they end up end-arounding and going to Instagram when TikTok fails them or the algorithms become overly restrictive. So I loved the quote in the video earlier about the persistence of these virtual communities. I feel like you hear a lot of the time, at least before the COVID situation, that digital interactions or digital friendships weren't real friendships. And I feel like our brains are very powerful, and there's plenty of great books out there about our abilities as storytellers. Those engagements, those relationships, those communities can be just as impactful as real communities. They're not getting their immediacy from the same destiny. Like, we don't have physical architecture, so it's the architecture of the platform that's guiding those. But there, as you say, there is some architecture that guides those communities. So I think hopefully through this COVID situation, we will become more robust and kind of resilient in helping communities flow back and forth between, as they say in gaming, meat space and digital space. But whatever you want to call the contrast between real and virtual, our communities exist kind of transcendent of either of those realities. So I'm glad you brought that into the conversation.
One of the other interesting things about this moment is here we are talking about how communications technologies are evolving in real time because of this crisis. And notice that almost all of the conversations here have been about how they've been used in the arts. Scarlet is evolving them in a deeply artistic medium. There's this jazz between, what we do at work and art. You live with a foot in the Gates Foundation trying to persist this stuff so that as they do global work, people can communicate better. And then with another hat, you're doing Twitch shows. At Gray Area, when we did the Gray Area Festival last year, it was also sponsored by Verizon, which was very interested in how 5G would be used in this stuff. And so there's this interesting jazz between the two of them. No one's been a better proponent of that than Marshall McLuhan, who also was speaking to us from 50 years ago or so, I asked him on this broadcast as well, because if we've learned that the virtual and the real go back and forth, why not throw it to Professor Marshall McLuhan, who had some of the most original thoughts on media and the arts?
The chances of your understanding anything going on in your own time are very small, except through the means or media provided by artists. Artists are people who enjoy living in the present.
Since the time of the Renaissance, we have been contained by a visual monopoly. Art was rigid and kept us out of the frame. Today, art is anything you can get away with.
My own way of testing the sorts of effects that any new form is likely to have on us is to keep a sharp lookout on changing styles in the arts. The artist is always a jump ahead of technology and is engaged really in giving you images of what sort of effects it's likely to have upon you later on. The effect of the electric revolution is to create once more an involvement that is total.
Okay, so this I thought this was great because I thought that was a great setup. Barry, I think in a moment we're going to go over to Salim and learn about his global conference. Any other invitations you'd like to do for Gray Area? And we'll come back after Salim, but as long as we have Cheryl here, I want to wrap this segment up. And anything else you want to help frame the role of arts and technologies and the virtualization of Gray Area right now?
Sure. I mean, I would say, in bouncing off what Professor McLuhan said, the history of art is a history of technology, and art is a technology. It's a means for helping us sort of externalize our thoughts into the environment, just like technology is. Again, like Professor McLuhan said, artists are the cultural bellwethers that are pushing the edge cases of what's going on, are expanding the map of possibilities for what these technologies can do. The experimentation we're doing with our arts community that we've built over the last decade at Gray Area is now going on our online platform Patch, which is patch.grayarea.org. We're doing a lot of experimentation there. It's a work in progress. And we're really trying to figure out how to make the most equitable technology stack to engage a sustainable artist economy and community with these virtual environments and bring this sense of space and multi-sensory environment back into this online virtual conversation, so we don't collapse back into staring down a keyhole in terms of our experience.
And a lot of this is about kind of very conscious design. And what is that? Oh, I've just been handed an urgent note. Professor McLuhan is back with some thoughts on some of the fundamental issues facing us today. Professor McLuhan?
We now share too much about each other to be strangers to each other.
For example, in the age of the information explosion, all the walls go out between age groups, ethnic groups, between family groups, national groups, between economies. The walls all go out. People suddenly have to adjust themselves to this new proximity, this new interrelationship. And merely to tell them that this has happened isn't very helpful. What they need to know is, if it is happening, what does it mean to me? The global village is a world in which you don't necessarily have harmony. You have extreme concern with everybody else's business and much involvement in everybody else's life. It's a sort of Ann Landers column writ large. And it doesn't necessarily mean harmony and peace and quiet, but it does mean huge involvement in everybody else's affairs. And so the global village is as big as the planet and as small as the village post office.
One of the things that McLuhan really hit there was this notion that when you do the global village, you lose privacy. and we're all aware of each other, and that leads to a form of anxiety. This is exactly what we saw early on in the world of blogging, where we're aware of each other, polarized things. I remember using that comment not far after the 9/11 attacks, and part of this was people with very different values around the world were just constantly aware of us. Then you see the rise of trolling and the fact that there was a disappearing of privacy. It's amazing how prescient both Youngblood and McLuhan and others were at the dawn of this, kind of catching this moment. Cheryl, you've been a student of this stuff, so I thought I would spring that comment from McLuhan on you as well.
Thank you. I know I tend to live my life out loud on the internet, and I know that's not for everybody. And I talked about the analogy between the work, these emergent performance narratives and sports. And I feel like that both of those things solve for the problem that the professor's talking about, that they give us something else to connect about that doesn't require us to bare our souls. And that brings something of genuine value. It allows us to connect in real time, have shared understanding, but doesn't require me to tell you my life story. I can do it later. That doesn't mean we don't eventually connect about that. But how many relationships are started because of a mutual interest in a sports team? The same thing may happen with these. It happens with traditional media all the time. What's different about this is that the media is inherently interactive, so the communities can spring up around that immediacy more quickly. So I think this kind of work is important because it gives us that way of communicating, of existing, of feeling like the world was different for us being there without projecting ourselves. And I know, you mentioned my work in productivity. There's a fatigue right now because the video into the home, I'm lucky that I have a fairly neutral space to broadcast from, but as we all know, that's a privilege, not the default. And so people in workplaces are being forced to share a lot more about themselves than they were ever comfortable doing before. So what the professor talks about, sharing too much of ourselves, it's forced. And even I find it tough sometimes when they're like, give us a tour of your house. I'm it is not ready for that. So there is something there, and we are kind of weirdly isolated, but losing some of our privacy in the moment, and that's a difficult space to navigate. I wanted to go back to something else that was in the previous clip, because the professor mentioned artists enjoy living in the present, and I would say probably almost no living human being enjoys living in this present time right now compared to 2 months ago. But I wonder if we could reframe that statement and say artists are those who let the present guide their living, because that's what's happening with the work that has been discussed today.
Yeah, and I would say maybe enjoy is the wrong, a lot of McLuhan may have used a different word than he normally uses. A lot of times he says artists are the ones that are attuned to the present.
That makes much more sense.
That they have, the job of an artist is to sense culture and sense these cultural traumas and be very attuned to the moment of the present and what's going on, and pull these sorts of unconscious perceptions that hit us all the time and externalize those in a way that we can communicate about. And so when I've heard McLuhan say that sort of stuff before, that's more of the terminology that he uses.
This is the longest we've ever gone on this show, probably because there's such curiosity about this moment, and I think teasing this stuff out is so important. So I just wanted to acknowledge to everyone that it's 5:37 Pacific Quarantime, and we'll wrap this segment up, and then we're gonna take a look at this great global conference. But to your point, Cheryl, a thing that I have felt is now that I've lost the friction of going to work or going to the gym or going out at night, it's all incoming, right? It's all the phone's ringing, the emails are coming in, everybody's having a webcast. Where are you? And I turned to my partner the other night. It's we have to reinvent the Sabbath. We have to stick our phones over there and do a schedule. And I suddenly realized why they came up with the Sabbath in the first place. Because when you're virtualized and everything's sped up, it is a little crazy making.
completely agree with that. We're struggling with that at the foundation. Like, you've got this really important work and everyone wants to do the right thing, but if you don't take time to breathe, and there's so much self-inflicted stress too. Like, we're all kind of feel like we should be accessible, even if that's not the expectation. And so I think a lot of important creating of safety right now, it's very important to state the rules of engagement with people to create that space. Maybe not a formal Sabbath, but like, I don't expect you to be on Teams 24/7. Like, if my message comes in and you're doing something else, that is fine. And let's avoid evening hours when we can. But even if it's 3 p.m. and I message you and you're out doing something else, we're human beings and this is a weird time. Saying those things and acknowledging that even though it's real-time media, the expectation doesn't have to be real-time is very freeing.
Final question for you. So what's it like at the Gates Foundation these days? You guys were the leaders in all of this public health stuff and predicted it. Then we have this public health emergency, and now everybody's gone virtual, and you're part of the team to keep people together. So what has that been like when you're both doing the most important work in the world and everything about how you work changed one day?
Boy, I am grateful that my role as a user experience designer and researcher embedded in IT doesn't exist at a lot of companies. And this is where it paid off because, we'd been spending a year where I looked at what the problems were facing us with productivity. I was like, well, Skype is one of them. Here's how we should move to Teams, but here's how we do it in a way that brings people along and gives them a strong mental model for how to use the product, how to do virtual meetings in the new tool. And we had only just adopted Teams as our new standard for meetings and chat right before the COVID stuff hit. We had been working up to it. We had been involving it like a lot. We had like 63% voluntary adoption or something. And then COVID. We're learning a lot more faster than I thought we would about like the next level of engagement that it would take. So then what I love about working where I work is that inherent curiosity that we bring to everything. And so we are like we're taking the moment to like look at how it's affecting us. At least my team is. We get the chance to like observe what's stressful, what's working, what's not, what emergent techniques for communicating are working, and where is productivity being harmed by missing tools or misconceptions. And I think the other thing that's really becoming apparent to everybody is that this is not a tools challenge. This is like it's a cultural challenge. Like, it is partially tools, but every company is going to have to come to terms with like what the culture they build around the tools they're using to communicate digitally. We're starting that introspection process to kind of figure out what that is and what we need it to be. But the answer for us won't be the same as it is for other companies.
Cheryl Platts of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and also of Muppet Aphrodite.
Muppet Aphrodite, yes.
Muppet Aphrodite. Performer and researcher, we want to thank you so much for your participation today. You talk about how we bring people together globally. For our final segment today, we're going to turn to Salim Ismail, who is putting together a global conference to look at some of these problems. And Salim is both a guy struggling with media, because here is a physical conference gone global, and how do you make all of that work, plus some of the most urgent problems of the day. I caught up with Salim a little bit earlier today, and we're also going to provide an invitation and a special discount to our audience. This is going to be a remarkable event that happens next Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So let's take a look at that. Salim, it's great to talk to you. Enormous changes in our political and technological landscape happen after crashes. You and I first met in 2003 after the 2000 crash. I was running a social media company called Technorati. You were at PubSub, and we were marveling that the world of social media was growing all around us.
That's right. We had like 20 million blogs, and everybody was freaking out.
Fast forward to today, through a financial crisis, and now perhaps the greatest crisis of our lives, and talk about both the ability to go flying off into something bad or into a future. This is kind of a sacred moment. And you have been working in your work at Singularity University and more recently with corporations on how people prepare for new ways of managing and bringing about change. And you're about to do a global conference, perhaps one of the first, looking at how we can use this crisis to get into something new.
Yeah, so kind of 3 quick steps. I think number 1 was I was the head of innovation at Yahoo running Brickhouse, their incubator, and learned a fundamental lesson that when you attempt disruptive innovation in a legacy environment, the immune system attacks you, right? And what blew my mind is I could expect that at a bank or a telco, but Yahoo was like less than 10 years old. Why should it have this problem? And so I was puzzled by that, went to be the founding CEO at Singularity University, and built it out for a few years, and then wrote a book called Exponential Organizations, because we noticed that we're building organizations in a completely new way, the Ubers and Airbnbs, where the org structure scales as easily as technology scales. What happened was when Corona hit, it was clear that nothing's going to be moving for 6 months. And when I look at what's happening and I lift above it, I think of this as a singularity. Every model that we use to predict the future breaks down. It's like a black hole kind of concept. That's what got me excited about singularity. It was not the technological singularity, but how do you navigate through black swan events? And we think this is an inflection point that we should take advantage of. As Paul Romer says, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. If everybody's stuck at home anyway, and we've ground the global supertanker to a halt, I figure we have 2 paths in front of us. We either have a Mad Max future or a Star Trek future. And technology can deliver us that Star Trek future. We have abundant energy within our grasp in a few years. Clearly, our politics and the way we're headed is a Mad Max future, and we would prefer to go down the other path. So we decided to create a global online event called Exo World. Like an exoskeleton supports the underlying body, Exo World aims to be like an intellectual scaffolding for the world in a difficult time. And we're convening the leading experts, politicians, change agents, and we want to galvanize a transformation of the world and set that course the way we want to do it.
Give us a sense for the conversations and who the lineup is, because you have heads of state, CEOs. There's a really interesting group of people.
So we have Maria Fernanda, the recent president of the UN, opening it up. And then we have anybody from Sylvia Earle about oceans to some experts on the economy. We have John Mackey from Whole Foods coming and doing a talk about conscious capitalism, because clearly that's a domain that we need to transform. We have several CEOs from global companies that are going to talk through how they're going to navigate their companies. More importantly, the question I want to hear is, how do they figure out signal from noise in this chaos? What mechanisms do they use to make sense of the future? Paul Saffel will talk about the future of transformation of cities. Peter Diamandis is co-hosting parts of it with me. This is basically TED meets Burning Man meets Global Hackathon. And we hope to come out at the back end of it with a new picture of the world that we want and set that into the global consciousness.
One of the questions is, how do you organize all this good energy and then actually start trying to bring about change?
One major theory is, we're going to give talk about tools like scenario planning, design thinking, science fiction writing to kind of elucidate and tease out that future. What we want to do is, we think this problem of the immune system is the underbelly of what's holding us back today. Because it doesn't matter how magical Bitcoin is if the bankers spend all their time fighting it, right? We have to get through that cultural cruft of it.
And there's a school of thought that says times of entanglement and speed, the processes we built that were deliberately deliberative may not work as well, that we may need new paradigms of thinking of how we make governance decisions quickly.
Yeah. And that's a central question, and I will give you a polarization. The 2 most important countries in the world, China and the US, which have polarized different governance models, both failed. China failed in reporting it early, the US failed in testing and a million other things. That doesn't work. The ones that have succeeded are the small, nimble, adaptable environments, Taiwan, Singapore, et cetera, et cetera. So we think the future, it's too complex to manage a big country going into the future. The metabolism is too slow. You have to bring the entire population around to make basic conversations around healthcare and other things. Whereas in a city, kind of everybody knows who they are. We think the city state is the future, and I know you're a big proponent of that in the work that you do. Our biggest cities, Sao Paulo, Tokyo, Shanghai, Mexico City, are bigger than almost any country was 100 years ago, right? And the metabolism of the democratic process in a big country with disparate interests is too slow. Can't serve the overall theme.
You know, you might argue that this is a shining moment for American federalism in the sense that Louis Brandeis said states were laboratories of democracy. And in a lab, some things work and some things don't. And you can see California did some things that worked. The federal government did some things that didn't work. And so we're getting a wonderful example of how things work at different levels. And the debrief from this may tell us a lot about decentralized work. I've got a final question for you. The experience of this conference you have coming up. You could take up to 100,000 people. So walk us through a little bit of what the experience
we'll do a warm-up session on the first. In fact, we're going to do a warm-up session on Monday afternoon where it's a free open space. Anybody can come. We'll have a few of our speakers doing a few things. And then we'll kick off at 7 a.m. with Peter and I talking through and framing the overall event. And Maria Fernanda will talk through and give us a couple of minutes on how she sees the future of the institutions. Then we'll go into our panels. And then after every hour or so, we're going to take a small break. People go do networking online. And everybody should go wash their hands. And then at the end of the day, a group of kids who have been listening all day are going to give their reactions because they're going to be running the world. So let's them say what they're thinking and have that every day. And we continue that flow. Late at night, we'll be doing a panel on China, for example, which is appropriate for their time zone, or India. We have a panel in Indonesia with the Minister of the Oceans there talking about the ocean situation. And so it's going to be a kind of a nonstop thing. All the sessions are recorded for people, for registrants to go look at later because of the chaotic time zone. And in the middle, when we have dead time, we'll just have music playing. We have a couple of Grammy Award-winning artists. So the whole thing is more of a festival almost than a typical conference.
We should remind our viewers here at Quarantime that we are a partner organization of yours. And if you buy your ticket from our Quarantime.today site, that also provides a little bit of affiliate funding for us to continue our show. So we're excited to work with you and watch this new model. How much are tickets? And
on the website, they're $297. For your viewers, we have $147, 50% discount. All proceeds go to funding the programs that come out the back end of this.
We will check back with you in the middle of your conference. Our show is on after this Friday show again Wednesday. You'll be at your halfway point, and so we can give a report on what's going on.
That would be great, and maybe one of our people, or if I have time, we can sneak on and say a few words. I really want to highlight the point you made at the beginning. This is a spiritual moment, and it's really a wonderful time to step back, be re-presence, and then start again in a new direction. We want to try and instigate that.
Yeah, Salim, thanks so much, and we'll see you at your festival, which is a conference, which is a new way of being.
And continue the awesome work that you're doing.
Thanks. Okay, that was cool. It's just more of the energy that's going on right now. That EXO conference is Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and we'll put more information up on the site. A little fight broke out in the comments thread about this whole nation state business. Salim talks about the fact that nation states are powerful. And there was a headline this week that said Gavin Newsom declared California a nation state. He didn't really, but of course, federalism and the power of the local has been a big theme in America from the start. And that point that I made, which is we're really seeing now what it's like for nimble local leadership to take place and how we hook up in networks. That's the interesting thing of this moment. And on some level, the theme of all of these conversations, how do you get all this global innovation hooked up and to come together? As we wrap up here, I think there's been some rich audience stuff. Anna, do you have some of the audience comments and conversation that you can share with us?
Hi, thanks for the show. Yes, it's been the amazing experience. It's just complete brain explosions. Each joined and our team and good work so far. And the comments are just as interesting. I mean, Mia is asking to something Barry said along with much of the conversation earlier today, whether it could be also that we end up with hyper global state as a result of the crisis, as opposed to hyper local, because so many in-person events globally will now be accessible from anywhere in the world. I mean, it's like, you know, the internet has already affected us a lot, but how do you see the world becoming even more global now?
Yeah, I mean, I think I may have not made my point correctly, but I think that it's these two opposing trends of hyperglobalism and hyperlocalism that are interesting. I mean, and you have this, it sort of bounces off the nation state conversation a little bit. One of the interesting things about watching this disease sort of work its way around the earth was that we have this, you know, electronic nervous system, this information superhighway out there. It's not like the information about what was going on wasn't traveling, but yet you could still see the time delay over the course of a couple of months of how, as the physical local effects of this situation touched each place that it infected, you saw the sort of social and governmental and, you know, economic effects of that. And even having that almost complete frictionless flow of free information, we weren't able to anticipate and get ahead of this thing. And you can chalk that up to inept leadership, you know, and there's a lot of things that can explain that, but it's still fairly interesting that at the end of the day, we're still in a hyperlocal circumstance and a hyperglobal information and headspace simultaneously. And what that means, I think, is one of the things that we're working out now.
Well, Barry, this has been, I want to thank you so much for joining and co-hosting now. I think, as many of you know, our regular co-host, Mickey McManus, was not with us this week because his father passed away from complications from COVID, but he's been watching and cheering us on. We'll be back next week. On Wednesday, we're going to take a deep dive into the Great Reset, into how organizations are looking at actually implementing local economic solutions. We'll be talking to Gary Bowles, who's been deep into that and has been doing work with Techonomy. We'll have the privilege of jumping in at the halfway point of Salim's global conference and having some of his people join us. And I believe next Friday's show, which is the show before Easter, we're going to take a deeper dive into ritual, spirituality, and self-care. And also, I think we're going to take a look at how we are preparing for a moment of more grief, more online funerals, because we're going to be passing through kind of the peak of all of this. And so I'm hoping to have some spiritual leaders and also kind of take a look at all of that. So that's our next week. I want to thank you all for this. Boy, did we go into overtime today. But I personally found this to be incredibly gratifying because I've just been so curious about watching media evolve in real time, and then had the privilege to be kind of part of this experiment that Scarlet and Erica put on, in which we were all living through kind of media growing in real time. And then Cheryl today sharing with her depth of experience, and Barry, Gray Area has really been amazing in all of this. I wanted to just bring you back kind of as we wrap up here. The Gray Area, the festival this year was going to be deep on immersive place-based media. What's your sense for kind of the conversations we'll be having? And also, what are the artist community that we're up to? How are they doing things differently in this moment where not only do artists have to go virtual, but they probably have very strong responses to this cultural moment?
Oh, of course. I mean, it's interesting that, we spent the last year on this experiential place-based media, and what the sort of coincidental part of it is that the next part of that conversation was this conversation around virtual simulated environments and how artists are dealing with this digital physical divide anyway. This situation just sort of accelerated us into it and made it so we, most likely it's unclear what we'll be able to do with a physical festival this year. Just don't have enough information yet about how those timelines will play out. And so at any rate, a substantial portion of it was going to look at these experiential technologies like augmented reality, virtual reality, and simulated environments in general anyway. And so this is really just a continuation of what we were doing anyway. Yeah, with the festival.
Yeah. Well, for those of you who are still with us, on Sunday, the expanded cinema conversation that we're having with Gene Youngblood, which is both looking to the past but very much the future. Here's the page. If you go to grayarea.org, you can sign up for it. You can also pop in and hear the last one that we did last Sunday. It's a fascinating conversation that brings together artists, the past, and how we're looking to the future. And then also at Gray Area, at patch.grayarea.org, are all of the rich online activities that are going on right now, including our classes. And I want to just commend you, Barry. You're probably one of the first. Every arts organization is now scrambling to go online, and it's tough if you're a symphony because you could buy records, but if you're and the symphony will probably evolve completely new things because it has a new leader who's very forward thinking. But in our case, when you have a vital artist community that are always becoming and creating new things, it's this a particularly exciting moment. And then also, remember, it's the weekend, it's the Sabbath, so we shall go home now. So I want to thank Omid, who has been helping to put this whole thing together and is our executive producer. Anna and Mia, who are our producers and have been helping out throughout the land. Mohib, who has been providing technical support from afar and helping us create all of this. And I want to thank everyone else. It is now 6 p.m. Pacific Quarantine. So I want to thank everybody.
Sorry.
And look, my watch is talking to me. That's I think that's a wrap. We will see you on Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining Quarantine.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.